So welcome everybody again, for those who were with us this morning and for those who has just joined us. This is a digital event of the European Institute for European Policy Making, in which, for all of you who are not familiar yet with our institute, is a new think tank inside Bocconi University, created almost 1 year ago to create a bridge between academic research and policy making. The original idea was by Mario Monti, and now the director of the institute is Daniel Gross, who I think is with us, or he will join us. And the idea is to, as I said before, to offer the opportunity to academics, to scholars, to interact with policymakers, and to foster this a more informed and scientific based debate about policies. So I thank you very much, Leonardo Borlini and Giorgio Sacerdoti, who are two of our fellows who organized this event, and all the guests who decided to accept the invitation. And we have a very prestigious panel. This morning was very interesting, and I hope we will have a lively discussion also this afternoon. So I give the floor to Leonardo to chair the session. Just one final say, please subscribe our newsletter that my colleague Georgia will send you in the chat, and please visit our website, which is full of interesting policy brief and articles. Leonardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefano. I would like to be very brief, also because I know that there are reason of time constraints for two of our panelists. First of all, thank to all of them for accepting our invitation. Giorgio will be joining us soon, and hopefully so also Professor Thomas Schönbaum, who I guess is usually very timely, very punctual. So he might have being the chance that we did not mention to him that we would have started 50 minutes earlier. The second panel today is to me very exciting. First of all, because I had the chance to see again some friends and very esteemed colleagues of ours who have written important fundamental pages of policy and technical commentaries on the law and the policy of WTO and international trade law in general. Andrei Sapir, Petros Mavroidis, Professor Thomas Schönbaum, and also we have with us Professor Washa Lai of Peking University School of International Relations. I am also as I mentioned today, we are going to speak about the future of the governance of international trade law, and specifically the evolution or the expected development within the texture of the World Trade Organization after MC13, Ministerial Conference 13. But this will be done in the broader, or within the broader scenario of yesterday. André shared with us some of the main points of his presentation, and we completely agree that these are very key and core issues that the international legal system, more in general, and not only the World Trade Organization, has to deal with in the next future. First of all, the increasing geopolitical tensions, especially among the major trade powers, but not only among them. And secondly, a problem of which we are all very much concerned about, climate change and environmental protection. And again, these are two core issues that are fundamental in the definition of the future of the World Trade Organization, more in particular, but also of the international legal system more in general, and of course international relations as well. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to our first panelist. Again, this would be a duo, Professor Petros Mavroidis, who is Professor of Law at Columbia University and the University of Neuchâtel, and Professor André Sapir, Professor of Economics at the University de Bruxelles. And they will speak about the road ahead for the World Trade Organization after the 2024 Ministerial Conference. Thank you very much.
André, who goes first?
You go first.
Ok. Grazie per l'invito, Leonardo. I will speak a little bit very briefly about dispute settlement after MC13, and André will speak about more generally where do we stand after MC13. So to move right to the point, I mean, the basis for the discussions was a paper submitted by the facilitator Marco Molina Tejeda. This is the reference to the paper. And it is the outcome of negotiations with various stakeholders. The majority of WTO members, I understand, were present. What I will do is I will divide my comments first into technical issues and then more policy-oriented issues. Now, the first part, I divide again my talk into strong points, weaker points, and what I think are omissions, which are key omissions. To me, the strongest point of them all is my first point. I mean, there is a document. I would have never bet any money on having a document by that time, quite frankly. I was very discouraged by the discussions in the previous years and by the DSU review in general. So the fact that we have a paper, a basis for future negotiations, is already something. I like very much two aspects of the paper. I like the placing the accent on mediation in times of crisis. I think we need to persuade each other once again that although it should be obvious that multilateralism matters, that we should not take justice into our own hands, and we should try to submit disputes to compulsory third-party adjudication. But we are now in a world where what we thought was obvious years back is not obvious anymore. So I like very much the idea of mediation. I could have done it in a simpler way myself. I don't see why we need to compartmentalize mediation. For example, I mentioned here I would merge the role of the DG with that of arbitration, but that's another story. I like also very much the panel process, one part of the panel process, the idea to nominate non-nationals. I think dispute settlement, in my view, has become extremely politicized. The fact that delegations take a longer time than ever before, and I have the data to this effect, to decide on who will be in the panel is quite telling. We never went through similar, of this magnitude, similar observations in the past. So maybe that's one way out if it's practiced with, let's say, caution and wisdom. Now, what I don't like is, I don't like this idea, and it's actually a specific provision on top of everything else saying precedent, there's no place for precedent in WTO law. I find this a little bit disturbing because, quite frankly, even if there is no stare decisis, I cannot think how courts can function without some form of precedent de facto. I mean, you cannot just say, I decide black, white, and gray depending on who is standing before me. I mean, the courts, they gain their credibility by revisiting prior case law. And of course, if they disagree, they can say, I changed my mind or whatever. But you cannot pretend past case law does not agree. To me, this is the quintessential element of dispute settlement. I also don't like at all, and here I have some sort of let's say ordinal value here of my preferences. I don't like the idea of backdoor remedies. I'm not a big fan of this idea of an advisory board that will discuss panel reports and come up with their own interpretations. I mean, it gives the wrong incentives to panelists, and they might start drafting reports in light of what politicians think the outcome should be. When a political body discusses, they don't care very much about coherence, they care about compromise. And it will be terrible if we end up with the panel reports which reflect compromises instead of coherent reasoning. I wouldn't spend any time discussing qualifications of panelists. Practice shows it's an empty shell. I'm not happy seeing the DG and the Secretariat appointing panelists. To me, this is wrong. The recipe for the appellate body should be the recipe for dispute settlement. The members should decide who the judges are and no one else. By introducing an additional layer, we only increase agency costs, and then we blame all sorts of people for having the wrong panelists. And there are cases, I cite them in my book, where the Secretariat blamed the membership blamed the Secretariat more than half a dozen cases for picking the wrong panelists. I also don't like the idea of limiting the number of pages. If I would limit something, it would be the number of pages of panel reports, not of submissions. If you tell the complainant, the defendant, up to 20 pages, you put into question their right of defense. To me, it doesn't make sense. The panel reports can definitely be shorter because they have unnecessary repetitions. But putting numbers, to me, doesn't make much sense. Now, omissions. In my view, I was a little bit, let's say, taken aback when I realized that we've been talking about the remedies in the WTO for a number of years now. That's one of the weak points in the sense that bargaining power at the end of the day is the decisive factor when it comes to enforcement. And the WTO is about it's a sum of unequal players, and there is no discussion at all about remedies in the report, as if everything is fine when it comes to enforcing the WTO contract, and it's not. We know it's not. Developing countries have made they've clamored for a change. Nothing happened. I would spend much more time discussing. To me, this is the key point. I would say much more time discussing who should serve as a judge and what the role of secretariat should be in the WTO. The WTO judge is in a very difficult position from the get-go because he or she has in front of him two incomplete contracts, one the WTO and the other the Vienna Convention, when you don't know where you should place the accent. So you require special skills and special knowledge, and not necessarily lawyer knowledge. I think you need economists who understand the WTO. I think you need historians who know the history of the agreements, and I think you need some very experienced practitioners as well. I would spend much more time discussing the qualities of the ideal judge, something like Dworkin's Hercules, to be in the WTO instead of just passing it by and pretending that the current system works fine. And then I would think twice before. No, I know the paper doesn't say much, and maybe on purpose, about do we need an appellate review. Clearly, this is a divisive issue. You have on the one hand EU, China, and many others who want to have an appellate body, but the US has made its views clear on the need to have an appellate body. I must say I have a sympathy for the US point of view. I don't see why we need an appellate body. This is something which you can anyway take care of within permanent panelists and some sort of a plenum which will be discussing the key points. Alan Sykes recently, 2 years later, wrote a paper exactly on the same. I strongly recommend people to read this paper because it's been the first support I've had on think a little bit about whether we do need an appellate body or not. Now, policy. I mean, this paper, one thing that hit me when I saw the MC13 outcome, the aftermath to MC13, I thought we had learned our lesson from MC12 and we would not be over celebrating, but everybody again is celebrating for doing the right thing and so on and so forth. And this the idea was now between now and the end of the year, we finalize the negotiation of dispute settlement based on this text. Quite frankly, I mean, the elections in the US are in November 2024. Let's assume that Biden wins. If Biden wins, can they finalize all this text, process all this information within what, 6 weeks, 8 weeks? Impossible in my view. And if Trump wins, maybe we're heading towards disaster. God knows where we're heading to if he gets elected. So I think the time they mentioned they should rethink about it, and in the meantime try to work the technical issues until the more, let's say, the heavier issues. They must be discussed after November 2024, in my view. But I have to say also that I don't know if the trading community is all in favor of compulsory third-party adjudication. To me, this is the ideal regime, by far. Go to a judge, let the judge decide, assuming the judge, of course, understands that he or she is an international judge, must be careful, should not overrule, should not overstep the mandate, and so on and so forth. But realism suggests, I think, that we take one step back. Maybe we should think whether, I mean, the WTO is an oddity in international relations. It's the only regime where you have compulsory third-party adjudication. It's not accidental that the Court of International Law, the ICJ, has the optional clause where those who want to go to the court agree ex ante to go on reciprocal basis, and those who don't want to go to court decide on an ad hoc basis. Maybe this is a compromise, or maybe a compromise is some sort of rebalancing. We'll accept compulsory third-party adjudication if some sensitive cases, but truly sensitive cases, not things like zeroing stuff, things like national security will stay outside the docket. I think we should not discard this because we risk losing everything if we insist on extreme legalism in the name of the 1994 agreements. It's clearly not the case. We cannot turn the clock back. This is one thing that we should have learned from the crisis in the last years. And with this, I'll stop, thanking the organizers once again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Petros. I was looking at your very concise but very insightful slides, and your viewpoint about having a compromise between, as you said, the extreme legalism of the 1994 legal framework and a more realistic, but still based on, you know, on judge control system is really something that we, I guess, the whole international trade community needs to address more carefully. I was surprised indeed when I saw that the only unique voices in the community questioning whether we really needed the appellate body working after the crisis were you and Alan Sykes, and I'm very happy that you reminded me and the audience about this, you know, very important problematic point. Now I will leave the floor to Andre.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Thomas,
Okay,
we see and hear you perfectly, crystal clear. And thank you also for the policy brief that you sent. Is already online at the page of the conference.
Oh, you're welcome.
No, it was really very welcome. So I will leave the floor now to Andre, and then, you know, I will immediately pass the floor to Thomas in order to have our panel concluded for the time that we need. But Andre, as soon as you need to leave, maybe let us know beforehand so that we might take some questions for you before the conclusion of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. It's a real pleasure to take part in this online conference with such a great group of scholars. As Leonardo already indicated, in my view, in order to try and understand what will happen to the WTO after MC13, including with respect to dispute settlement that Petros just talked about, we need to focus on the two issues that are absolutely crucial, I believe, for the current and future development of the international system, not just the international trading system. The first issue, obviously, is the geopolitical situation, and in particular, the China-US confrontation. This confrontation makes, as we see every day, international cooperation, including regarding trade, extremely difficult. You know, trade, and for trade economists like me, what we teach to our students is that trade is a positive sum game. All countries that participate in international trade benefit from this participation. When you look at issues from a geopolitical perspective, it's a completely different set of mind and set of attitude that one has, which is essentially a zero-sum game. Because if you talk of geopolitics, you talk about power. And if I have more power, you have less power. So this is, you know, what I mean, a zero-sum game. There are winners and losers. We cannot all be winners of this kind of game. So we have something that is really difficult for all of us who have been raised with the multilateral trading system and this positive sum game that I discussed. Now, it's obviously difficult to be optimistic about the WTO as long as geopolitical considerations continue to dominate the trade narrative. And certainly when it comes to issues like dispute settlement, it means, I think as Petros already indicated, that geopolitics and therefore issues like national security need to remain outside of the adjudication process by the WTO, though the need to avoid that purely protectionist motives are couched into national security ones, and therefore escape adjudication is absolutely crucial. So one needs to find that balance. The WTO cannot adjudicate about national security, but we can't afford that countries abuse the national security narrative. A difficult balance to find. The other issue that I want to flag is climate change. Now, by definition, since the climate problem is truly a global one, climate change cannot be addressed without international cooperation. In a sense, climate change and avoiding climate change is the ultimate positive sum game. It cannot be handled by confrontation. It cannot be handled by geopolitics. Cooperation is absolutely vital here. Viewed in this light, the problem of climate change must inspire us in the same manner that international trade cooperation did inspire the founders of the GATT and later the WTO. The challenge, therefore, in my mind, is to ensure that the WTO plays an important and perhaps even central role in fighting climate change, as I believe Dr. Ngozi, the Director General of the WTO, has been trying to do for some time. If we want the WTO to have a future and a bright future, we should hope that this initiative of hers and others who want to put climate at the center of the trade discussion, that those initiatives succeed. And I think we should lend our intellectual support to those initiatives. Trade and climate is where many new trade policies, or rather policies with an impact on trade, focus. Think about industrial policies, in part through subsidies. In China, sure, also in the US with IRA, but also in the EU. And also think about many of the recent EU instruments, climate instruments that do have implications for trade, like CBAM or like the Deforestation Directive. In this respect, I find the recent writings of Pascal Lamy on what he calls the trade, climate, and development triangle absolutely the right one. We have to remember, and I think that's why we can't just talk about trade and climate, there is a development dimension here. We have to remember that advanced economies like Europe, the United States, Japan, and other OECD countries, what people refer to as the global north, we altogether only account for 1/3 of current carbon emissions. The other 2/3 come from the global south, including China. So if you look at those 2/3, half of that 2/3 is China, and the other half is the rest of the global south. So global emissions, 1/3 the advanced countries, 1/3 China, and 1/3 India and other developing or emerging countries. And all of those groups need to work together in order to deal with the climate change. And sure, there is a trade dimension, there is obviously a climate dimension, but indeed there is also a development dimension, global north versus global south. All this being said, and to conclude, I should say that coming out of MC13 and looking to the future, I'm perhaps less disappointed about what happened at MC13 and in general the current situation at the WTO, that many, and I suspect a number of participants in today's conference may be. Given the centrality of geopolitics, and geopolitics is not just conflicts, it's including war, as we know. So given the centrality of geopolitics in today's political and even economic public discourse and action, I find it heartening that all or nearly all trade ministers did attend MC13 in Abu Dhabi, and that WTO rules continue to play such an important role in the trade policies of most WTO members. So yes, the glass is half empty, but it's also half full. The current situation is no doubt worrisome for the international trading system in general and the WTO in particular, but I think we should not despair about the possibility of international cooperation in many areas, including, and perhaps most, when it comes to this triangle of trade, climate, and development. Let me stop here.
Andre, thank you very much for this very brilliant contribution. It's indeed full of insights for everybody, and I guess that your position of being less pessimistic than most of the panelists at least this morning is shared by others here, me included, because it's true. The system is not at its peak, but is not probably performing way worse than other form of international cooperation, which are needed for the very reasons that you mentioned. And about the triangle, actually, I was myself starting a research on the trilemma. We call it the same. I didn't know about Pascal Lamy's paper, but this is somehow flattering for me. Of course, his understanding of the problems is way more profound and complex than mine. But I do agree that the perspective of developing countries and the global South, if we can still call it this way, must be included in the debate. Now, I would like to leave the floor to Professor Thomas Schurmbaum, who actually will contribute to the discussion of today by speaking about the Biden economics versus MAGA economics on trade law, pick your poison, meaning about what we might have actually as the elephant in the room that also Petros mentioned quite clearly, meaning the outcome of the U.S. election the next fall, and the problems of the perspective that this might have for also the future of international trade law. So I'm without further ado, I'm leaving the floor to Thomas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Yeah, it's an honor to be here with such distinguished members of the panel. Thank you, Leo, for inviting me. This election is going to be the most crucial in my memory for many reasons, and for international trade law. The Trump administration, the first Trump administration, did a real nut job on international trade law. And let me mention just 6 points in that regard that I rue the day that these 6 things happened, but they did. First of all, you all remember, I think everyone remembers the Section 301 case brought against the United States, seeking to declare that Section 301 was inconsistent with WTO obligations, and Section 301 survived. As you remember, it was not the United States was not determined to be in violation of WTO law, but the only reason I think that the 301 case survived and that the United States obtained a good outcome in this case is that there was a statement of administrative action which President Clinton submitted in connection with the 1994 Uruguay round implementation. And in that statement of administrative action, the United States Congress, not only the president, but the United States Congress solemnly promised to wield the Section 301 weapon of domestic U.S. law only with respect to consistency with WTO obligations. In other words, the United States eschewed invoking Section 301 unilaterally. The idea was that the United States would invoke Section 301 only in compliance with the WTO standards, which would be after a violation has been found and in the implementation of some punitive measure. Well, this policy, which was in effect and a solemn obligation of the U.S. Congress, as well as the president, this obligation was abandoned without any fanfare, without any notice. It was simply repudiated by the Trump administration and the Trump U.S. TR. In other words, the United States, without even announcing it beforehand, decided it would take it would simply use Section 301, not only Section 301, but a couple of other sections, Section 201, which is a safeguard U.S. law, and Section 232, which is a national security domestic U.S. law, and the USTR, Trump's USTR, without any simply took for granted that the United States would wield that weapon unilaterally inconsistently with WTO obligations. So this was not even the U.S. obligation was not even noted at the time. It was a very troublesome legal development. So that's my first point. And in connection with that point, I want to mention that the Biden administration has not reversed this policy. They have not, the Biden administration has not invoked Section 301, but the Biden administration has defended the Section 301 tariffs on China, and the Biden administration has not revoked this new policy since Trump of invoking Section 301 and other domestic trade laws unilaterally. My second point is that the United States, at least during the Uruguay round and in the aftermath, always took the view that and joined by the international community that international trade law was superior to U.S. domestic law, and that it was up to U.S. domestic law to conform to the obligations of international trade law. This policy, of course, without any fanfare, was totally reversed by the Trump administration, 180 degrees, so that now U.S. domestic law is in the forefront, which trumps, excuse the bad pun, which trumps international trade law. So international trade law in the United States plays a secondary role. And this policy also was not repudiated by the Biden administration when it came to power. The third point is that, as we all know, the United States de facto has withdrawn from the WTO. I don't think the United States plays much of a role now. And of course, the United States has secured the fact that the appellate body ceased to function in December 2019. And this policy, which was actually started by Obama, but really came to fruition under Trump. But this policy has not been reversed by the Biden administration either. A fourth point, the United States, of course, as we all know, renegotiated NAFTA, concluding a new agreement, the USMCA, and this was negotiated first with Mexico, then with Canada, and it was negotiated not in a positive sum game manner, but in a zero sum game manner. And this agreement, the USMCA, has been called the first free trade agreement in history that actually decreases free trade, which is what it really does. it isolates the U.S. market, especially for automobiles, and on the whole, it's a very negative agreement. And then the last point, of course, which has been referred to before, the trade war with China. This was a tit-for-tat trade war that the Trump administration fell into and carried out until in January 2020, there was a truce, which was declared as a result of this very strange and one-sided agreement between the United States and China. The Trump administration, or the Biden administration, has not renounced this agreement. And by the way, the Biden administration has called the USMCA one of the greatest free trade agreements. So I've been very disappointed in the Biden administration, and I'll have more to say about that in a minute. But now, what will happen if Trump is reelected in November and takes office in January of 2025? Well, I think it'll be a disaster, economic disaster as well as a legal disaster. It's already public what Trump intends to do. He intends to double down on his nationalistic and populistic free so-called trade doctrines. He will make a really big job of it this time. What he intends to do, first of all, it's been announced that he intends to put a 10% surcharge on tariff on all imports into the United States, every last one. This will be a baseline import duty that of 10% on all imports into the United States. And his advisors have singled out China for two purposes. First of all, his advisors have announced that they intend to downgrade China to non-MFN status and to basically declare that China does not qualify for Article 1 of the GATT MFN status. And in addition, the Trump administration advisors have announced that they intend to place at least a 60% tariff on all imports into the United States from China. So these are some of this is going to set off another trade war, not only with China but also with various countries around the world if it comes to pass. So he intends to double down on his nationalistic and populistic trade policies. Now, if this is done, I think that the big difference then between the Trump administration, if it's reelected in 2025, and the Biden administration, if Biden is reelected, the big difference is that under Trump, if Trump is president, there will be a decoupling of economic and certainly national security decoupling between the United States and China. And that will have very severe consequences for the rest of the world as well. And it won't be pretty. That's, I think, what's going to happen if Trump is elected. If Biden is reelected, on the other hand, I think Biden and the Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen, has embarked on a policy of de-risking, not decoupling. In other words, safeguarding what they consider are national security issues, but not specifically decoupling. Right now, well, what happened in 2017 when Trump took office, China was actually the biggest trading partner of the United States, both countries. Now there has not been any decoupling, although the Biden administration has defended the Trump tariffs against China. But China is still the third trade partner, the third-ranked trade partner of the United States. So under Biden, I think Biden will try to manage and de-risk trade between China and the United States, and may liberalize somewhat. But there will be, I don't think, any new tariffs under Biden. But under Trump, I think there will be an attempt to decouple the United States and China economically with the disastrous consequences that entails. Now, I'm no fan of the Biden USTR and the Biden trade policy, and I would cite instead of in place of Biden's policy, I would cite two critics of Biden's policy, and that is Larry Summers and Robert Zoellick. Both these men have advocated a third way. The Biden administration is simply old-fashioned protectionism. The Trump administration will be protectionism, kind of a new breed of protectionism based on nationalism and populism. But the Biden administration's protectionism is directed toward trying to revive manufacturing in the United States, which really is a stupid policy, but they adhere to it. But the third way that I would advocate would be based on several principles. Number one, negotiating new free trade agreements. The Biden administration has refused to negotiate any new free trade agreements. The United States has eschewed the TPP and any negotiations with the EU. But I think that both Zoellick and Summers believe that the United States should enter into negotiations with Pacific countries, with the EU, and with the Western Hemisphere countries and Africa, and should conclude new free trade agreements. But this is not. There's no sign of this that they intend to do this. But that's my first point. The second point is that the United States, I believe, should enter into serious negotiations and trying to deal with the problems that the United States has with the WTO. But again, the Biden administration has shown no willingness to do that, to do this, and it doesn't seem that they will do that if they're reelected. So, but Zoellick and Summers believe that this should be a second point of the of any new USTR administration. And third, there should be a revival of multilateralism. And as Petros has written about very eloquently, the United States has been going it alone, and the solution really is multilateralism, not unilateralism, with respect to solving these very real problems. So I would advocate a third way, which would be different from either the Trump administration, if it takes office in 2025, and the Biden administration if it is reelected in 2025. But I'm very pessimistic that this will happen, and it looks as if the choice between Biden and Trump will be the lesser of two evils as far as trade is concerned, and the best outcome we can expect is that Biden is reelected and has the courage to take some new initiatives in trade after he's reelected in and takes office in 2025. And lastly, I just want to say that I did a 16-page paper. If anybody wants it, I'll email. They just have to email me, and I'll send it by email. And thank you very much for the pleasure of speaking.
Thank you very much to you, Thomas. It was really enlightening at some point, also sobering, I would say, because of course the scenario that both scenarios that you are describing are not going into any favorable direction for multilateral trade. And of course, I am pretty sure that we will have plenty of time to discuss that in the question and answer session. I have the pleasure to read your paper since we had corresponded on that, and it's very complex for a non-US citizen or expert, but at the same time very enlightening on the possible scenario that we might have from late November on, when the new administration will be settled down. And just because I will have many comments, but just because we have so many contributions, and my friend and colleague Washa Lai has already given ample evidence of her physical endurance in Seattle when he spoke. I think that you spoke when in China was 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. and now it's late for you again. I'm very happy to give you the floor and to listen to your contribution about the state of the World Trade Organization legal framework in relation to the UN Sustainable Development Goal, which is a point that also Andre has brilliantly addressed in her speech. And then we will have plenty of time to collect questions from our audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonardo. It's a real pleasure for me to be part of this very exciting discussion. I mean, as the least experienced people on this panel, I feel really humble. And I mean, I read all of the other panelists' papers, books while I was a graduate student. I studied under the mentorship of Professor Schoenbaum in Seattle, and just being here today to be part of this panel and discuss the future of the WTO, it's just like such an honor for me. So thank you so much for having me here. So I'd like to share my my slides. Is that okay? Okay. Just 1 second.
Okay, I guess that if you look at at least in my Teams, I have it on my bottom. You will have an icon close to your microphone. Yes, that's it.
Yes. Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I feel like I couldn't see the slides myself, but I'll just do it anyway. Okay. Thank you so much for having me. And here's my thoughts on the WTO law and the sustainable development during this very special time of geopolitics. So now I'm assistant professor at Peking University School of International Studies. So I'll be talking from a more interdisciplinary perspective that combines the insights of both international law and international relations. So first of all, let's take a look at the SDGs themselves. So we know that there are 17 goals within this Sustainable Development Agenda. This has been advocated by the United Nations and have been largely accepted and even like internalized by many of the member states of the UN, of the WTO. So if you take a look at the 17 goals, you will see that it is almost everything. this is quite different from our previous understanding about sustainable development within the context of the WTO. So I think between 1995 and probably 2010, many of the sustainable development related WTO disputes had more to do with environment than any of the other things. But here we could see that climate, energy, clean water, life below water, just basically fisheries or fisheries subsidies, gender equality, everything is now being framed as a sustainable development thing. So we have this very broad and expansive understanding of what constitutes sustainable development. And it has come to, I think, all of us attention that this is a very common theme in international multilateral negotiations, not only just under WTO, but in other contexts like human rights and investment, etc. So how do we reconcile any intention, let's just assume there are, between the SDG and, for example, trade law? So we know that WTO rules, most of them were not originally drafted with the SDG in mind. They were largely negotiated in the 1980s or 1990s, and much of the gap could be even traced back to the 1940s. So the original drafters, they did not think about SDGs when they let down the fundamental rules of international trade law. And because of the consensus decision-making mechanism at the WTO, it is really difficult to come up with new binding rules that applies to most of the countries in the world. I mean, there have been a few progress, but overall, I would say that the what has been accomplished in terms of promoting sustainable development has remained largely limited. Leonardo asked me to take a look at what has been going on at the Ministerial Conference 13 a few weeks ago that are related to the sustainable development. So here is what I have been reading about. There were quite a few interesting side events at the Ministerial Conference and related to sustainable development would include discussions about plastic pollution, further discussion about the new fisheries subsidies agreement. There were discussions about phasing out fossil fuels in the context of climate change and also promoting circular economy. But unfortunately, those discussions have not yielded like much concrete results in the sense of like binding rules or like having more countries joining to ratify the fisheries subsidy agreement. So yes, SDGs has been on the agenda of the multilateral trade negotiation, but we don't really see much progress going on. So that's can you see the next slide? I'm not sure if
at least okay. I can. We have it projected in my.
Thank you so much. So since SDG is such a broad term, I think we only have like 15 minutes in total. I guess because we are discussing about climate change as the most prominent threat to the human being's existence, I think we can focus or take the example of clean energy as part of this SDG issue and see how the WTO has been dealing with this issue. So first, let's take a look at the production of clean energy. It is highly concentrated among a few big economies, including China, the United States, EU, etc. And that, I mean, this very high level of concentration would also mean very likely that these big economies would like to fight over each other, and at the WTO or outside of the WTO, to claim the or to be the most dominant one in the clean energy market. So on the right of the page, you could see a number of disputes related to this clean energy production. And most of the cases, not all of them, many of them are like tit for tat disputes among these like big three countries or economies, US, China, and the EU. And they largely involve like the same legal issue of subsidies, like whether subsidies to renewable energy production is legit and legitimate or like legal under the existing SCM agreement of the WTO. So speaking from Beijing, let me show you what has been going on in China and how is that related to the very recent discussion about renewable energy subsidies to under the WTO framework. So for those of you who have been following the recent development of Chinese trade policies or Chinese trade in general, there is this like new term, this new buzzword called New 3. In Chinese, we call it 新三样. And there are the solar cells, the lithium-ion batteries, and the electric vehicles, the EVs. So these three things have been the most popular goods exported by China, and they have contributed the most to China's renewed momentum in terms of exports. And so here we're talking about the new 3. So what is the old 3? So the old 3 refer to the furniture, the clothing, and household appliances. I mean, China has been the like powerhouse, or like has been termed as the world factory in the past, because it has exported so many things in these sectors. But increasingly, we are seeing that China is getting very competitive at this global level in exporting these clean energy products. And of course, the rise of the new 3, the solar cells, the EVs, etc., they should their very rapid rise, their success story, owes much to the Chinese government's subsidies, very generous subsidies to the production, consumption, and even exporting of those products abroad. And of course, these new 3 have become targets of tariffs from both the US and the EU. Well, China is not the only economy that is dispatching large quantity of subsidies to clean energy products. For example, at the USA, we have heard a lot about the US Inflation Reduction Act, which features lots of subsidies for clean energy products, including EVs, for domestically manufactured goods from the US. So 2 days ago, China initiated a new dispute settlement proceeding against the US at the WTO. And here's a statement from the Chinese official. So this IRA and the subsidies China is trying to contest and challenge at the WTO is under the disguise of responding to climate change, reducing carbon emission and protecting the environment. These subsidies, they are discriminatory and contingent upon the purchase and the use of goods from the US or imported from certain particular regions. So again, the China-US trade war has been going on for quite a few years, and the most recent focus, the contention point, has been on this clean energy products. So how is that related to our speculation, our discussion over WTO and the future of SDG? Well, maybe it's time to take a few steps back and take a look at what the WTO has achieved in reconciling the tension or the potential tension between trade and climate, or trade and environment, or trade and other SDG, sustainable development goals. So if you look at the history of the WTO appellate body's jurisprudence, it's very clear that the appellate body has played a very critical role in preserving the regulatory space, and in some cases delineating the boundary of the regulatory space for non-trade public policy goals. And here are a few examples. So right after the WTO came into being, in the US gasoline case, there's this very famous line by the appellate body: the general agreement is not to be read in clinical isolation from public international law. Well, in this case, the public international law actually referred to the VCLT rules on interpretation, but that let the appellate body, or like enabled the appellate body, in the next case, a truly landmark case on trade and environment, the U.S. shrimp turtle, to refer to international environmental law when it had to interpret the meaning, the substance of what constitute exhaustible natural resources under GATT Article 20G. A few of the other cases, like the EC asbestos cases, the appellate bodies like products analysis, had a very clear and very profound legacy when it comes to differentiating between like products with an environmental dimension. And also in the case the US Tuna 2, the appellate body read regulatory spaces into the TBT agreement, even though the TBT agreement did not have, or does not have, this Article 20 equivalent under the GATT. And I think 11 years ago or 12 years ago, the very first case under the WTO on trade and climate change, this Canada renewable energy case, the appellate body in this benefit analysis, the understanding, the commentary on this case can get really complicated, but for a lot of people, the appellate body's benefit analysis in this case provided some shelter to the SEM, the subsidies agreement for renewable energy subsidies. And in particular, the appellate body's discussion about positive externalities and the critical role that government plays in creating a renewable energy market. I think that all can be part of the WTO appellate body's very successful story in interpreting a more sustainable development friendly way when it comes to dispute settlement under the WTO rules. So looking ahead, I think there are a few things we need to take a look, to observe in a very careful way. And the very first one, especially relating to the clean energy products disputes, that string of disputes. I guess the core question is really about whether the public policy exceptions under GATT Article 20B and 20G, whether they should be applicable to the interpretation of the SEM agreement. And even more importantly, as many of today's panelists have discussed when it comes to the future of dispute settlement body, if we take a look at the history of the AB, it is very clear that an effective appellate body is more likely to push forward an interpretation that is capable of reconciling trade and other SDG concerns. This is particularly important in the absence of binding legal framework on climate change and clean energy, we still have a very fragmented international legal framework. We have the Paris Agreement, we have the UNFCCC, we have the WTO rules, we have other rules, but they are still highly fragmentized. So it is up to the appellate body, I mean, in the absence of an overarching legal framework, to interpret the existing legal obligations in a SDG more friendly way. And this is also important in the context of a very high level of geopolitical competition. The previous panelists, they have all brought into the discussion of the significance of having in mind the geopolitical competition when we are talking about the future of the WTO. So the geopolitical competition has made it almost impossible to conclude new agreements, either on trade or on other issues within the framework of the WTO. So in that case, who should take up the heavy lifting job of helping to reconcile the tension between trade and sustainable development goals? I think now the dysfunctional appellate body may be the only answer when the rulemaking procedure is not making any progress, and also when the heightened geopolitical competition makes it very difficult to have an unified legal framework for the human being to proceed. So that will conclude my discussion. Thank you so much again for having me here.
Thank you very much, Mosha. I think we now can move to the questions from the audience, because I want to leave Petros and Andre free to go when they have to go, because they managed to have our panel in between different commitments they have, and then I myself might have some questions, but of course, there are we have to prioritize the audience, and I ask anybody, Stefano, if you want to step in. We have two, actually. You can raise your virtual hand and make a question yourself, and then otherwise you can write the question in the chat, and we will pass the question on to our speakers. The only requirement is to be brief, of course, because of the time concern. So there is a question here from I can't really see. So Stefano, if you...
Yes, I see. Just a second, Giorgio, but I don't see the surname. So if you could please introduce yourself, we will allow you to intervene, and so you can introduce yourself. Okay, we know you very well. Okay, it was not clear from the name. Okay, Professor Sacerdoti, please, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I had some problem here. I cannot. Can you hear me now? Now the image disappeared.
Yeah, we can hear you, not perfectly, but we can hear you.
Okay. Excuse me a second. I have to. A phone call's come in just now. Well, I wanted to comment Petros. I know that Petros has been very active in devising ways in which to accommodate the existence of a binding settlement system to tie with the U.S. reservations. My view is the following. I mean, it was exceptional for the U.S. to accept a binding ex-ante dispute settlement system. It accepted it because there is no domestic enforcement, direct effect. It was an economic, technical matters, helping to open foreign markets to U.S. exports. And when the system turned, the case law turned against the U.S. for them unexpectedly on zeroing steel, something which I think economically is has little relevance, but politically is more hot. Here they come and block the whole system in order to escape binding settlement system. I am very perplexed that the US will accept something. If, like Peter says, you remove from dispute settlement binding something like economic security and make it self-judging as the US wants, then you have an imbalance of obligation. Any country can say, hey, here, I put in this restriction, which economic security, you cannot judge. The other parties have are bound by their commitment and we are not. I think it was wise to reply to the US steel extra duties by the EU and others to say, well, in fact, it's a safeguard and we can respond immediately with rebalancing. But the panels found that this is not in conformity with the SCM agreement. So maybe experimentally MPA could be will remain longer, and maybe like in EU Turkey, also the US and countries which don't participate to the system, like Indonesia or India, will on an ad hoc basis arbitrate in appeal some cases, and they will then profit from more flexibility that the case law of the MPA arbitrators may inject vis-a-vis the more rigid appellate body interpretation and case law. And there we can then convince parties who are profiting from the non-bindingness of the system to enter slowly into the system. I don't know what Petros and other thing, and I thank a lot also, if I may have floor just another second, Professor Huaxalai. She pointed out that the appellate body has gone a long way to accommodate non-trade interests into the trading system, and has been maybe more flexible on non-trade obstacles to trade than on purely trade restrictions by some members under the dumping or subsidies agreement. That's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, so if you can also write in the chat if you, for whatever reasons, you don't have the opportunity to or you don't want to intervene. Maybe we can collect a couple of questions. I just take the opportunity to ask a question. Okay, Professor Schönbaum, I don't see him there, but the question is also for the others. My question is, in case of Trump's victory and in case of extreme protectionism, this might be a problem, a serious problem for the US. But is there any chance that it can prove an opportunity for Europe, especially for Europe, and to foster the connection between Europe and China in a moment where the situation is getting quite tense? Because, I mean, if the relations between US and China become even worse, maybe the relation between Europe and China, I mean, they become relatively better if the alternative is the US led by Trump. That's my question. But anyone else?
I have, again, just to break the ice, I have 3 different questions to 3 different speakers, so then we can collect. And first of all, to Petros, because I know that he had quite an important say on the case that Huaxalai mentioned, meaning he wrote an important paper on the turquoise green subsidies in 2014, blue industry, and the turquoise messed blue industry and green subsidies, and the opportunity to redraft the subsidies agreement. And I want to ask you first if you see any room in the future to have a sort of at least plurilateral renegotiation of or modernization of the subsidies agreement, meaning plurilateral, as you know very well, but some of the audience might not know, an agreement which is not covered by the single undertaking rule of the WTO, meaning an agreement which is open only to parties that wanted to join the agreement and are not obliged to join the agreement in order to, become or remain member of the WTO. And I guess, and my question is whether you see now the opportunity for this, advancement of the discipline, especially for the importance of green subsidies. The other question that I would have for you is just to side on your point on the panel. And on the opportunity of having, or the possibility of having again a World Trade Organization appellate body, is to see whether or not you have an optimistic view on the possibility for the US to accept a new dispute settlement system, as you basically feature in your former intervention, meaning led by panel and panel alone, and some sort of accommodation for possible panel reports which are not accepted by the parties. And then for Andre, I would like to know from your economist viewpoint exactly what we are clearly biased here. I mean, this is an Institute of European Policymaking, and I have the same question that Stefano made addressed to Petrus for you. If you see any room for the European Union in case of a disastrous, let's say, or a very close attitude of the US towards its relation with China, to step in and somehow accommodate the relations. I am more pessimistic because I read and I'm studying that the package that the European Union Commission proposed in January 2024, and I also know that there is a major issue with electric vehicles for the manufacturers in Europe, but I'm no economist, and I would like to know your opinion. And then for Professor Schoenbaum, the same question, basically. If according to you, I don't see you, Thomas, anymore, but I hope that you can hear. Otherwise, you can simply ignore my question. I read your paper and I heard very carefully to your speech today, and I know that you are quite pessimistic in both scenarios. Meaning, you said that is the least evil, the second best, or the least worst what we can have with what we can hope with the election. But I wonder whether realistically, in the mid-long run, there is still a possibility for us to hope that the US will somehow re-participate actively in the WTO, even if the WTO is, or especially if the WTO framework is changed. So with that, I stop, because otherwise I take too much floor. I just, wanted to make these questions because I know that some of the speakers have to leave, and because I didn't really see any other people asking from the audience. So.
Wants to start? Someone has to start with the answers. I think. I don't know if there is any other question. Otherwise, we go with the first round of answers, right?
I think Andrea can start because he's more pressed with time.
Okay.
I have still 20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Petros. I think indeed most of the questions are to you and about the dispute settlement. So I will only make one point, and this is in a sense the more political or more geopolitical one, if I interpret correctly. What happens for EU policy, EU trade policy and EU policy towards the WTO and multilateralism if Trump is re-elected and the US takes a increased unfriendly policy on trade, increasingly unilateral, putting tariffs, a 10% tariffs on everybody, a 25% tariff on China, all kinds of things of that sort. And what should the EU do? And sorry, Stefano said, is this an opportunity for Europe? What about China? I would definitely not use the word opportunity. I would say it's a headache, not an opportunity. No, not at all. Doesn't mean that the EU cannot do anything, but you have to remember that we are also engaged in a war on this continent, and Ukraine is there, and we are part of a security arrangement, military security arrangement with the United States, and we need that security arrangement. Maybe at some stage we will have more autonomy, not open strategic autonomy, but more military autonomy. But this is not going to happen in the next 6 months. And as I said, there is war. There's war in Ukraine, and we don't know how this will continue. So, no doubt or dependence on the United States will remain, I think, very, very important from a military, from a strategic viewpoint. So that's why I would not use the term opportunity. What we can do, is navigate into this. So I think Petros and we agree that at the WTO, to start with the easier thing, at the WTO, yes, the EU, I think, should, and I don't see that as an opportunity, but should, since I think it is our interest to have a multilateral system in general. It is a question of interest. It's not just a question of value. It's a question of our interest. Yes, we should promote various initiatives at the WTO, even in the absence of the United States, and hope that at some stage the United States will be able to participate again. So hope that this is an interim period. So again, I would not call that an opportunity. I would say it's a responsibility for us, again, in our own interest, to defend even more, not less. Obviously, there will be a fight in Europe. There will be those who say, you see, and you hear that already today, we are naives. The US does not believe in multilateralism. China speaks very nicely about multilateralism, but doesn't really believe in it. Look at their action. So why is it that we should be naive and put all our eggs in multilateralism? We should also have a more realistic viewpoint. No, that is not my personal attitude, but I hear that, and I think it will be harder and harder to resist that within Europe. But I think that, yes, we should resist that. And, therefore we need to take initiatives. And that's why I think that also from a European viewpoint, climate, which has been so important in the agenda, maybe it will be a bit less important in the next commission, but I think Europe will remain committed on the green agenda. So I think it's our interest, I think it's the global interest to try to revive multilateralism via climate. Now, again, what we will do if the US takes even tougher measures, and China also vis-à-vis the US, if the two of them in their economic and political confrontation increase trade measures vis-à-vis one another, what will we do? Are we going to suddenly rebalance towards China? I doubt it. We will again try to navigate, and this will not be easy. We do not have the same problems with China that the US does. We are not geopolitical rivals, like the US is a geopolitical or military rival to China. But yes, and somebody raised the issue of electric vehicles, one can see that the issue of economic rivalry, and especially in the economic transformation that we are facing towards climate change, that is an issue. So it's a bit, for us, the situation that we had with Japan 20, 30 years ago. How do we manage our economic relationship with China? No geopolitical or little geopolitical concern, except what the US is doing and what we need to do in order to retain very much the US military protection. But otherwise, our economic interests vis-à-vis China, I think, is not dissimilar with what happened with Japan earlier. We saw how we handled cars and car disputes with Japan 30, 40 years ago. Yes, we have the same kind of disputes with China at the moment. I don't think that it will destroy our relationship. It's a difficult moment, but one that is manageable, and I think one where we can come to agreement. But ditching the US for China, no, this is not going to happen. Let me stop here.
Yes, Petros, please.
Grazie. Dovremmo organizzare una conferenza live a Milano, no? Così non è piacevole, facciamo con...
Lo faremo sicuro, Petros, lo
But
faremo.
Leonardo, I have to thank you for many reasons for including me to this, but one big reason is you gave me the opportunity to see again my very dear Tom Schenbaum, who I haven't seen for some time. And we are now working on the 4th edition of our book. So we have to correct the absence of contact this fall. I'll come and visit you. We definitely have to get together. I'll do it. Now, on the questions. At first, there are two questions for me, I think. I will combine Georgios and yours, and for dispute settlement, and one on the other on subsidies. To me, subsidies is a priority. I mean, it is for so many different reasons. One reason is we have to discuss with China what's going on, especially after the appellate body case on public bodies. We have to discuss with China, where do we draw the line? Because clearly this is the area where we disagree. We don't see the world the same way. And when I hear from some people who say, oh, state-owned enterprises we have in Europe as well, or the US has a bit less. True. But in Europe and the US, state-owned enterprises are subjected to antitrust enforcement. This is not manifestly now not the case in China. I mean, we have so much evidence now. There's so much. I mean, we have to. This is now the problem. I see two problems, and one is what I see two additional problems actually. The other reason why we need to discuss subsidies is because it's an outdated document. It was done with. We had in mind the world where there were no global value chains. This is precisely why Article 1 says, if I subsidize my subsidiary outside, I'm US, and I subsidize my subsidiary in Japan, and I export to China, nobody can impose countervailing duties against me. But the world we live now is a different world. It's a world of global value chains. That's the second reason. And the third, and probably the most important, is the one you were, I think, insinuating, my dear Leonardo, when you said, what do we do with, let's call them good subsidies? And this was the case of Canada. There is no mechanism in the WTO to compensate subsidies which create positive externalities. Positive or negative, it's one and the same. Now, we can do it in different ways. One way is to say, for example, there are 10, 12 international agreements. We annex them and say, if you subsidize for these reasons, you're fine. Or there are so many ways. I have something, by the way, it's almost done. It's a paper with Alan. Well, so I'll send to you when it's done. But it's exactly this idea. How do you compensate when there are positive externalities? But this you cannot leave it to panels and the appellate body. Because the appellate body, what did it say in the Canada case, actually? I mean, it didn't say much. Because if now you have the same case and somebody says, oh, appellate body, by the way, non-renewable and renewable energy are like products. So by doing what you do, you take away market share from my exports. What would the appellate body say? No, they are unlike. Based on what? And let's assume Article 20 is applicable to SEM. Let's assume. And I say, okay, Article 20, how do I go past the chapeau? If I'm the US, I subsidize all producers of energy around the world. Who will do that? I mean, unless if we rethink the subsidies agreement, it's a dead end. Now on dispute settlement, oh, by the way, I'm not sorry, the last point here, because your question was, do I see room for plurilateral and so on as well? I don't know, Leonardo, I'm getting very pessimistic here, because when they discussed a paper which was not even, was semi-academic, semi-institutional, OECD, WTO, IMF, World Bank on subsidies, everything we discussed so far was outside the paper. The key questions were missing. That's why I'm pessimistic. Even at this level, they cannot address the elephant in the room. Now, on dispute settlement, I don't know what the US will accept, but I do know that the US was definitely on the good side during the Tokyo round and after the Tokyo round. They requested compulsory third-party adjudication. They were also in favor of academic panelists. I mean, I cite in my book 3 or 4 papers. One said, forget about ambassadors. Let's get people like Tom Schembaum, who are totally delinked from the government, to come and say what is good and what is wrong. As of 1993-94, the steel lobby and the law firms around the steel lobby, from 94, I mean, if you look at the discussions before the Congress, Lighthizer with Alan Wolf, who has changed his mind over time, of course, they were against Holmer and the USTR guys who wanted to have compulsory third-party adjudication. So I was not surprised when I saw Trump, because this discussion has been going on for years. What I do say is there is some self-inflicted damage. The appellate body could have mitigated the problem. I hate zeroing. I've written 10 papers against zeroing. But when you have 2 provisions which are on prima facie contradictory, 17.6 and 11, why couldn't the appellate body or a panel, whoever, I don't want to blame the appellate body, panels did the same mistake. Say, take the question back, membership, rethink a little bit here what you want me to do, and when you have an answer, I will adjudicate. I am prepared to live with a 2% of US trade protectionism if it is to save the WTO. That's why I say there's a bit of self-inflicted damage. So in today's world, and I take Giorgio's point, Giorgio has a very good point. He says, if we say national security is non-justiciable, which is a similar discussion, maybe we give anyone who wants to not play by the book the incentive to do so. It's true. There is this risk. But look at the downside, on the other hand. I mean, I'm not saying that my whatever proposal is the first best. Not at all. It's a second or third best proposal. But again, because I want to save the WTO, what do I observe? First of all, any WTO member can routinely argue before the WTO when they have an Article 21 case, 21A. I'm divulging no information because it goes against my interest. What will panels do? Draw inferences on national security? Are we serious? I mean, unthinkable. But I'm not saying, and that's what we did, the paper we did with Bernard and Doug Nelson, we're not saying do not discuss national security. We don't say no scrutiny. We say no judicialization. Do a committee on national security, take this discussion there, close the doors so people can speak, because national security is not something you're going to tell the world about. Enlarge the scope of national security. To me, when General Marshall goes to China in the 40s, the mission failed. But when he went there, it was a question of national security. They say, I want to have, now you might not call it like that, but that's how the US and the Truman administration was seeing it. I'll take some preventive measures in order to avoid trouble later. Have an enlarged understanding of national security, bring in economic security, and discuss it in a different committee where you don't have panels and you don't have people saying, this is right, this is wrong. Because think of the costliness of the error. If I make a mistake, how can I trust the WTO if they get it wrong on national security? It's not like saying your anti-dumping duties were inconsistently imposed. Who cares? That's a commercial damage. But national security, you touch what one of my heroes, a Swiss American political scientist, Wolfers, used to say, the pole of power for a state. You cannot put into question uncritically. So I do think that, I mean, a reasonable administration by the US, and I hope there will be a reasonable administration in November, is prepared to play along those lines. Now, will they do it? I don't know. I mean, Tom knows much better, but I think it's Biden's second term. He knows he's not facing a third term, the prospect of a third term. So he might be tempted to be a little bit more brave and say, this is our international order. We built it. We're not giving it up on anyone. We have to reinvest to make sure it stays as it is, because it served the US interests very well, and many other countries as well. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Petros. It's exactly what I wanted to hear in terms of intellectual contribution. Also, if
I did it on purpose, so you invite me to come to Milano. That's why.
No, but you will get it for sure. We have to organize that. In a good way, in a proper way. I wanted also to mention the issue that you said about the court and national security and why, and zeroing the problem of two contradictory provisions, and why the panel also and the WTO appellate body, they didn't really stop that. I guess that, psychologically speaking, at least as far as I had the chance to see, international judges, they don't really like the non-liquid. They don't really like to say, we do not have enough law or enough clear law to have a pronouncement here. Something that, at least in continental civil law jurisdiction, we have. And on subsidies, I could not agree more, especially if you think that, the so-called green subsidies or good subsidies exception has a limited time and elapses in 2000. So right now, as you said, every good subsidies without a mechanism to compensate it is actionable, and in a time of geopolitical tension, that would be probably even more dangerous. And then I really look forward to see your paper on and with Alan Sykes on the compensation, because this is something that we had, for example, in the European Union jurisdiction, with Article 107 and 108 and the pre-screening by the Commission, and and was the point that Alan Sykes always made in his famous paper about the sensibility of regulating subsidies supranationally, and that's really something that I'm eager to read before even inviting you next time in Milan in person. And then we have,
or you invite me to present it there with Alan.
Yeah. I mean, and we have also we have an open invitation to Thomas Schoenbaum as well, that he whenever he can, he will join us in Milan. And we had some questions from him, one from Stefano, one from myself. And if you want to add anything to the debate, of course, also Washa, you can step in, since you were the one that rightly put the emphasis on the Canada renewable subsidies opinion. And I know for sure that if Giorgio is online, he will tell us something more about the strong case for having the appellate body again, but I don't know whether he's online. I'm stop here and I leave the floor to our two panelists. And of course, if there are any other questions from the audience, we will take it. Tom, if you want to, I just recap the two questions, or Stefano, you want to recap the two questions for Tom?
No, yeah. I mean, my main question was whether Trump administration might paradoxically turn into an opportunity for Europe, because it will force Europe to have a different role, and maybe China doesn't have another option but relaxing its policies towards Europe, because the US will be out of the equation. And I don't know.
And mine was actually reframed way better by Petros. So I quote Petros: if we have a Biden administration and a little more brave or exposed to international trade, Biden administration, if there is any chance that the US will somehow contribute to at least modernize the system where the system really needs to be modernized, such as, for example, subsidies, on which Petros has enlightened us so well.
Well, I would say that the EU very rightly complained about the Biden administration. The Biden administration is doing two things that are directly contrary to the WTO. In addition to maintaining the old policies, the Biden administration has passed 4 major laws that grant subsidies. I think most of these subsidies are contrary to WTO rules and subsidies agreement. And the second thing is that the Biden administration is emphasized by executive order buy American. And that is also a danger of violating WTO rules. So the Biden administration and the Europeans have been very nice about it, and they negotiated the Boeing Airbus dispute away, and the Europeans have been very forthcoming, but it's unpredictable what will happen if either Biden or Trump take office, and one of them will, it seems, in January 2025. So it's going to be, I think, a bleak time for international trade policy, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Tom. I actually I don't really want to close on this very sobering note, but I agree. I agree that I agree that the time is not calling for optimism. Actually, I have a question for Washa, Professor Washalai, because I guess at one point that we, at least me as a moderator, I haven't considered so far attentively or carefully is the position of a Chinese scholar. And you rightly said about in your last slides and your last part of presentation about the immense amount of subsidization that right now exists, or the vast amount of subsidization that right now exists in China for the not only for the production but also for the consumption of, for example, of EVs, electric vehicles. And living in China for 2 months last winter, I was surprised myself because it was not the first time I was in China, and the entire scenario, at least in Shenzhen and Beijing, changed extremely. But this point is something that I want to connect your perspective with Petros' contribution to the discussion on subsidies. And Petros, yes, you will be invited to discuss your paper, simply because I want to read your paper. I want our PhD students to have a first-hand evidence of what really good scholar, solid scholar, can do with such a complex topic as subsidies. That is probably the most complex in international trade law or international economic law, as Professor Lowenfeld wrote in his famous book. And yes, Washa and we were educated with your and Tom's book, and we were eager to see the next edition. But my point here is, Washa, you were listening to us and listening also in Seattle and in other venues to the many complaints we had as European or as US citizen and trade lawyers about the use of subsidies in China. But what is your perspective from your viewpoint, not only as a scholar? You are an international economic law scholar, so you have the privilege viewpoint, but because my perspective was that somehow in China this worked. And it's really difficult to bring China to the table to negotiate a new way. And I agree 100%, even more with Petros, that the ACM agreement is the first thing that we have to modernize if you want to revitalize the WTO. So here I have really two contrasting or ambivalent feelings. I mean, your system and the system that apparently work, and the perspective that for us is true. We have enforcement in Europe for state aid. We call it state aid, and in the US is the same. We have antitrust enforcement. We have undertakings and companies in both the US and the European Union that if they have a dominant position, no matter what, even if they are state-owned or they have attempted monopolization in the US, they will be subject to antitrust enforcement. So I really see here what Petros and I really hear what Petros bring to the table as a contribution, because this is really again, as you said, the elephant in the room. Not even in an academic / policy contest such as the venue that was joined by OECD, World Bank, IMF, and WTO was really possible to discuss this point.
Thank you, Leonardo. I feel like, okay, so not putting on the hat of a trade scholar or IR scholar, I would just say that subsidies are extremely popular in China. And very few Chinese, like average people, would even think about whether it is compliant with WTO law. Okay, this is like we are discussing among a very small community of trade lawyers or international lawyers or IR scholars who actually know the existence that industrial policies are not okay under the existing international trade legal regime. And if you look at the application or distribution of subsidies within China, they don't really pick any winner. I think it is like applied in a cross-board way. And so the domestic different various producers, they're encouraged to compete among themselves. And that is how, I mean, at least this is according to some of my colleagues, that is how the EV industry, EV sector in China has developed so fast within the past 10 years, okay? And this also happened during a time when the other countries, EU and the US, I mean, they face incredible domestic obstacles in giving out like such generous subsidies and supports to their domestic manufacturers. Like China doesn't really have this thing because of the unique political system we have here. Okay, so I feel like if you ask like whether Chinese decision makers are going to take the WTO complaints very seriously and take a step back from the existing subsidy regime, I guess not very likely. I mean, we have seen from this string of cases where, I mean, in a few cases, I think China actually decided to stop a certain subsidy measure, but that was probably after like very interesting settlement with the other party. So both sides made concessions, I guess. But overall, I mean, you were in China, you have witnessed how popular EVs are in China. It's everywhere, it's very affordable, and it's definitely climate friendly. And this has been the signature feature of the current administration's foreign policy, to be the next leader on climate change issues. So would you blame China on giving out very generous subsidies to EVs and solar cells? It's like, I feel like WTO is extremely important. That's why I study it. But it's not the whole thing. I mean, for many people, climate change might be even more pressing issue or challenge for the entire species. So, and what is the right way to move from the current position and also try their best to leave aside the geopolitical rivalries. Again, I would go back to my point. I think a very independent and highly respected trade lawyers within this mechanism appellate body or the MPIA, I think they are probably the only people who can make the sound decision for the time being. I mean, if we take a look at the previous trade environmental disputes, I mean, when the decisions came out, they were quite controversial, I would say. But give them 10 years, 20 years looking back, they make total sense. They were even the leaders among the international lawyers. They had a vision for sustainable development or for global environmental well-being. And also, you probably have heard this from me. I mean, the investment legal regime, investment law, is in an even more deep crisis. And their solution out is to develop an appellate body modeled after the WTO appellate body, right? Or the extending mechanism in the model of a WTO appellate body. I think that says something like people's faith in this mechanism and people's faith in the brief but brilliant history of the appellate body, that they could make the right decision when it comes to very thorny issues, when it requires to balance so many parties containing and contrast interests. That's just my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I don't really want to add anything else because I see that the situation is really, I mean, at least to me, it remains probably a stumbling block. And as Petros said, there are fewer reasons to be optimistic about the possible reformation of the regime, that reasons to be optimistic. I do not know, because my Teams is not working very well, if there are further questions from the audience. If not, I guess that...
Apparently no. Apparently not. So.
Okay, there is no second round of question. I don't know whether Giorgio want to say something to conclude our discussion today. I know that Petros and Andre had to go for good, because Petros was in the middle of a very committing arbitration process, and Andre had other institutional issues. I also see that you put in the chat the hyperlink to Professor Sherman's policy brief, which I enthusiastically recommend to all our participants today, and especially our PhD students. If there are no further questions, I wanted to thank you all for the extremely insightful and very, at the same time, approachable for non-trade lawyers, but also extremely insightful for trade experts discussion today. And I very much hope that we will be able to, have another meeting in the future. We're inviting you in person, Thomas. I know that you are that you have many commitments and you cannot really always, travel, but that you have an open invitation. The same was true for Washa Lai and Stefano. If you want to say something to conclude our discussion.
Yeah, I just would like to thank you all, especially Leonardo and Giorgio Sacerdoti, for putting together such a great discussion, and a special thanks also to Thomas Schönbohm for his policy brief that you can read on our website. I think it's incredibly insightful and very well written, which is not obvious for policy brief. So I definitely recommend to read it. And just a final recommendation to subscribe the YEP newsletter, because I hope we will have other opportunities to join together, maybe in a few months, maybe in person, but I think that was a great start for this discussion. So thank you all.
It's been my pleasure.
Hello, everybody.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Good to see you all.
Again, and I thank you all.
Okay, we heard also Giorgio Sacerdoti, so I think that we are done. So thank you all again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.